The air in the bedroom was heavy, as if it carried years of unspoken exhaustion. Maxwell Anderson, billionaire CEO of Anderson Group, stood frozen in the doorway of his 10-year-old son's room. His jaw had slackened, his hands trembled slightly, and for the first time in 3 years, he felt the alien stirrings of something dangerously close to joy. On the oversized bed, Andrew lay fast asleep. His red-rimmed eyes were finally closed, his lips parted just enough for a steady breath to pass. And there, seated upright with her back against the headboard, was a girl in a worn-out ash-gray gown. Her face was marked with dried dust. Her bare feet told a long story of pavements and hunger, yet her arms were wrapped around Andrew with an instinctive protectiveness, one hand stroking his back in slow, hypnotic circles. Her name was Adana. An hour earlier, she'd been just another barefoot figure beneath the Oshodi Bridge, invisible, anonymous, surviving. Now she was inside the Anderson mansion, having accomplished something the best doctors in Lagos, and a small fortune in medical fees, had failed to deliver. She had made Andrew sleep. Behind Maxwell, 2 security guards stood rigid, mouths slightly open in disbelief. He turned to them and whispered, almost to himself, "He's sleeping." Adana startled at the sound of his voice. Her eyes, wide and uncertain, met his. "I just sang for him," she said quietly, as if confessing to something illicit. "That's all." It wasn't, of course. It never is. Maxwell stepped into the room, careful not to disturb the boy. He eased Andrew from her lap onto the bed, adjusting the blanket with the reverence of someone handling fragile glass. Then he looked at the girl again. The dust, the gown, the impossible kindness in her eyes. "Follow me," he said softly. Maxwell Anderson was not a man given to superstition. His empire stretched across continents. His calendar was measured in board meetings and acquisition deadlines. But Andrew's insomnia had been the one battle he could not win. It had started abruptly after the boy's 10th birthday. One night, he simply could not sleep. Every doctor in the city had tried, every therapy had failed. Sleep only came in brief, unsatisfying bursts, and never without Maxwell present. That morning, in a rare act of concession, Maxwell had decided to take Andrew with him to the office. On the drive back, while waiting at the gates of their Lekki home, Andrew had tapped on the car window. "Daddy, who's that?" Maxwell followed his gaze. Under the flyover bridge, beside a pile of scrap metal, a girl sat shielding herself from the sun with a torn umbrella. A chipped plastic plate with a few coins lay at her feet. Her hair was matted, her body hunched against exhaustion. "I think she's homeless," Maxwell said evenly. "She looks sad," Andrew replied, his voice carrying a strange note of urgency. Maxwell hesitated. He had written checks to orphanages, funded schools, paid hospital bills for strangers. But this was different. This was his son asking. Within minutes, they had crossed the road. He had asked her name, Adana, and given her food and money. Then, almost impulsively, he'd said, "Do you want to come with us? We can help you." Before she could process the offer, Andrew had grabbed her hand. "Come stay in my room," he'd said. Maxwell had laughed then, not knowing how quickly the boy's wish would take root. In his home office, she sat stiffly on the chair, glancing from the gold-framed portrait of Olivia, Maxwell's late wife, to the panoramic painting of the Lagos skyline. She explained in halting sentences. She'd sung a lullaby, the one her mother used to sing before they were taken. One night, men had broken in. Her parents were gone before she could climb out from under the bed. She'd never seen them again. She had been a top student once, all A's, but street life had replaced classrooms. Begging kept her alive. Maxwell listened, fists tightening. Then, in a voice quieter than she expected, he said, "From today, you are part of this family. Andrew's sister. I'll take care of you." She began to cry, quietly, into her hands. That night, Maxwell stayed awake in his study, staring at old photographs. One envelope, still sealed since Olivia's death, sat in the bottom drawer. He opened it at last. In her handwriting, urgent and deliberate. "If something ever happens to me, and you find a girl named Adana, protect her as you would protect Andrew." Maxwell stared at the words. How had Olivia known? Maxwell sat in the dim light of his study, the letter still trembling in his hands. The paper was aged, the edges faintly yellowed. Olivia's handwriting was unmistakable, each stroke deliberate, each curve heavy with intent. If something ever happens to me, and you find a girl named Adana, protect her as you would protect Andrew." He turned the page over. There was more. "Adana is the daughter of my best friend, Sandra. She saved my life once. We lost touch after she moved to Abadan. She had a little girl. I couldn't find her after the crisis, but I made a promise. If I ever found Adana, I must help her." Maxwell leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. Sandra. He had heard Olivia speak the name years ago, in passing, but had never met her. The thought that the dust-covered girl now sleeping in his son's room was the same Adana from Olivia's letter was dizzying. Morning came slowly. Adana awoke not to the cold grit of concrete beneath her, but to the soft weight of blankets and the scent of lemon and flowers. At the foot of the bed lay a neatly folded blue gown, a pair of slippers, and a note in careful handwriting. "Good morning, Adana. Please wear these and come to the garden when you're ready. Maxwell." When she stepped out, the transformation was subtle but unmistakable. Clean hair, sunlit skin, a dress that fit. She saw her reflection in the glass of the gazebo and almost didn't recognize herself. Andrew's face lit up the moment he saw her. "Adana, you're awake." "I slept all night," he announced, clinging to her waist. "I didn't wake up once." Maxwell watched them silently before asking the question that had been burning since last night. "Do you remember your mother's name?" "Yes," Adana said without hesitation. "Sandra Okoye." It hit him like a physical blow. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the letter, and handed it to her. As she read, her hands began to tremble. "She promised to protect me," Adana whispered, her voice cracking. "Yes," Maxwell said, his throat tight. "Your mother saved my wife's life. This isn't a coincidence." For the first time since she'd arrived, Adana's tears weren't the kind born of survival. They were something sharper: grief, shock, and the faintest hint of hope. Weeks passed. Adana adapted to life in the mansion quickly: private tutoring, her own room next to Andrew's, and a wardrobe that no longer smelled of rain-soaked pavement. But she didn't forget. Every weekend, she insisted they visit the bridge, bringing food and clothes to children still there. Maxwell, perhaps moved by her persistence, built a shelter near that same spot and named it the Olivia Sandra Foundation. Andrew's nightmares had vanished, but one night, a new disturbance came. Thunder rolled through the city. Rain hammered against the windows. Andrew burst into Maxwell's study, eyes wide. "Daddy," Adana's crying in her sleep. They found her tossing in bed, whispering, "Mama, don't go, please." When Maxwell woke her, she gasped for breath. "I saw her," she said. "I saw my mother. She was behind bars. She was calling my name. She's alive. I know it." Maxwell knew that look. It wasn't fear, it was fire. That night, he called a private investigator in Abuja. "Her name is Sandra Okoye," he said. "Missing for over 10 years. I need you to find her." 3 weeks had passed since the stormy night when Adana woke from her dream of her mother. The image refused to fade. Rusted prison bars, a voice calling her name, the desperation in Sandra's eyes. It followed her into daylight, into her lessons, into her quiet moments in the garden with Andrew. She poured herself into volunteering at the new foundation, but Maxwell could see it. The way her gaze would drift to nothing in particular, the way her shoulders tensed when the postman arrived, as if she were waiting for a letter that would never come. Maxwell kept the search discreet. He didn't want to raise her hopes without proof, but the restlessness inside him was undeniable. Olivia's letter, Sandra's name, the uncanny way Andrew had connected with Adana, it all fit together too perfectly to ignore. And then, one quiet Sunday morning, the waiting ended. Adana was in the garden with Andrew, painting terracotta flower pots. She laughed when Andrew, with the precision of a 10-year-old prankster, smeared a streak of green paint across her cheek. Maxwell appeared on the patio, phone pressed to his ear, his face pale. "Adana," he called softly. She looked up, her laughter fading at the gravity in his tone. "I need to talk to you," he said. Alone. Inside his study, an older man stood near the window. His suit was plain brown, his posture military straight, and his eyes missed nothing. "Miss Adana," he began, his voice deep and deliberate. "I'm Detective Namdi Obi. I've been working on a case related to your mother." Adana's breath caught. "You found her?" Namdi hesitated. "We believe so. But what I'm about to tell you is not simple." Maxwell gestured for her to sit. She lowered herself into the chair as if her legs no longer trusted the floor. Namdi pulled a faded photograph from a folder. A slim woman with deep brown eyes, the kind you could fall into. That's her, Adana whispered. That's my mother. Namdi nodded. She was last seen in 2011, after a series of raids in your neighborhood. Multiple homes were broken into by masked men. Several women were abducted. Most were never found. Adana's fists clenched. Where is she now? Namdi took a breath. We traced her to a rural prison facility outside Abadan. She's registered under a false name. Grace. Likely assigned by her captors. This prison is not official. It's a secret site, used by men in power to hide those they want silenced. We believe your mother saw something she wasn't supposed to, something connected to a powerful politician. She's trapped. Adana's voice shook. Yes, but now that we have her location, we can work with human rights lawyers to secure her release. Maxwell rose from his chair. I'll fund everything. Lawyers, security, whatever it takes. 2 months followed, a labyrinth of bureaucracy, deliberate delays, and veiled threats. Anonymous calls warned Maxwell to drop the case. Government offices claimed the prison didn't exist. Every forward step felt like trespassing into someone's guarded empire. But Maxwell's resources and Namdi's relentless digging eventually cracked the walls. And then, on a rainy afternoon, a black sedan pulled up to the Anderson mansion. Adana stood on the porch, trembling. The back door opened. A woman stepped out, thinner than in the photograph, her frame fragile, her eyes older but unmistakable. Mama. Adana's voice was almost a child's again. Sandra Okoye blinked, lips parting in disbelief. Adana. They collided in the rain, collapsing to their knees, sobbing in each other's arms. Maxwell stood in the doorway, his own eyes wet, while Andrew peeked from behind the curtain. Is that her mom? He asked. Yes, Maxwell said softly. That's her mother. Sandra's recovery was slow. The years in captivity had taken their toll, leaving memories fragmented, some gone entirely. But she remembered Olivia, Maxwell's late wife, and the promise they'd shared. You married a good woman, she told Maxwell one evening. She would have been proud of the daughter you've raised. The house filled with new sounds. At night, Adana still sang to Andrew, but now Sandra's older, honey-warm voice joined hers. The harmonies seemed to stitch something invisible back together in the mansion's air. 2 years later, Adana stood at the gates of the University of Lagos with an acceptance letter to the College of Medicine clutched in her hands. She had buried that dream under a bridge years ago. Now it was alive again. Andrew was the first to hug her. You'll be the best doctor ever, he declared. Maxwell threw her a party, inviting neighbors, friends, even the staff from the foundation. For years past, Adana graduated top of her class, gold medal, valedictorian, the whole hall on its feet. From underbridge girl to Dr. Okoye was now part of Lagos folklore. It was at a health tech summit that she met Anderson Okafor, a 28-year-old software engineer from Anambra, with a mind sharp enough for algorithms and a smile soft enough to disarm her caution. Conferences led to dinners to something steadier. Maxwell noticed. So did Andrew. One afternoon, in the mansion's garden, Anderson knelt beside the same flower pots she and Andrew had painted years ago and held out a ring. Adana, he said, from the moment I heard your story, I knew you were extraordinary. Will you marry me? She said yes. The wedding at Golden Bell Estate stopped traffic in Lagos. Celebrities, dignitaries, business leaders, all present. But the image that endured was Maxwell, tears in his eyes, walking her down the aisle. Sandra shone in gold in the front row. Andrew stood tall in his tux, the little boy who had once pulled her from obscurity into family. That night, at the reception, Andrew pulled her aside. I had another dream, he said. She smiled faintly. What did you see? He didn't smile back. A man in the shadows. He said, your father is still alive. Her breath caught. The morning after her wedding, Adana sat at the breakfast table with a cup of tea gone cold. Her new husband, Anderson, reached across and covered her hand with his. You didn't sleep last night, he said quietly. She shook her head. It's not wedding nerves. What is it? She hesitated. Andrew had a dream. He says my father is still alive. Anderson frowned. You told me he died the night your mother was taken. That's what we thought. But we never saw a body. I was hiding under the bed. I heard screaming, saw shadows, and then nothing. He was gone. Do you believe the dream? Adana stared at the table. I didn't believe the one about my mother either. And then we found her exactly where he said she'd be. Anderson leaned back. Then we'll find him together. Later that day, she went to Maxwell's study. I need Detective Namdi again, she said. About the dream? Maxwell asked. She nodded. I know how it sounds. But so did the last one. Maxwell didn't argue. He had learned to stop dismissing the improbable. 3 days later, Namdi sat across from her. A large map of Nigeria spread out on the table. Your father's name was Chuka Okoye, correct? Yes, she said. He was a building contractor. He worked in Ibadan, Osogbo. Namdi tapped a spot on the map. We went through old police records. There was never a death certificate. Just a missing persons report that went cold in 2012. Rumors said he was taken, not killed. Taken by who? That's the question. But Namdi slid a blurry photo across the table. This was taken 2 months ago by a community leader in a remote village near Kogi State. He was documenting a road project. Adana squinted. 5 men stood in the photo, wearing dusty work clothes. One of them, taller, older, with a thick beard, had eyes that seemed to look straight at her. Her pulse quickened. That's him. Namdi nodded. The villagers call him Papa Kelechi. They say he wandered in years ago, injured and confused. He could build anything, but remembered nothing about himself. Maxwell's voice hardened. Where exactly is this village? Namdi circled a tiny dot. Nekede. No cell service. No proper roads. Anderson, who had been silent until now, said, Then we'll take a chopper. The next morning, a private helicopter skimmed over fields and dusty roads before landing near Nekede. Children ran alongside them, wide-eyed at the sight of the machine. An old man led them through narrow paths to a wooden house with a tin roof. Inside, a man sat carving wood. His beard was wild, his hands calloused. When he looked up, Adana gasped. Daddy, she whispered. The man frowned, confused. I don't know you. Her voice broke. It's me, your daughter, Adana. He rubbed his temples. Adana. I've heard that name before. Then something in him cracked. He clutched his chest, breath ragged. Flashes, gunshots, screams, a child sobs under a bed. He dropped to his knees. I had a daughter, he whispered. Adana fell to her knees with him. I'm here. I found you. He reached out and pulled her into a trembling embrace. My little girl. Back in Lagos, Chuka received medical care. Fragments of memory returned, enough to tell the story. I was kidnapped by the same men who took Sandra. They thought I had information about a property I was building for a corrupt senator. When I refused to cooperate, they beat me and dumped me near Kogi. The villagers saved my life. That night, Andrew sat with Adana on the balcony. If your mother was taken and your father was taken, he said, maybe someone planned this. Maybe your family was targeted. Why? She asked. Because someone out there is still afraid of the truth. The next morning, Namdi returned with old files Maxwell had requested, land records, contracts, client logs from over a decade ago. Chuka, Maxwell said, did you work for any government officials or politicians back then? Chuka frowned. 1. Chief Dominic Ain. He was building a private estate outside Osogbo. But the land papers were fake. I raised concerns. That night, our home was attacked. Namdi exhaled. Dominic Ain is now a senator. Powerful. Untouchable. Maxwell slammed his palm on the table. He silenced Chuka and buried Sandra to protect his secret. Adana's jaw tightened. Then we have to expose him. The room went silent after Adana's words. Exposing Senator Dominic Ain was not a matter of simply pointing a finger. Men like him had fortresses built from influence, fear, and decades of quiet corruption. Namdi said it first. We'll need evidence, the kind that even his allies can't bury. Andrew, who had been leaning against the wall, suddenly spoke. I think I've seen something. Everyone turned to him. I was digging through Dad's company server for an old science project, he said, glancing at Maxwell, and I came across some classified files. One of them had Chuka's name in the metadata. It was stored in a folder marked Classified, AK Projects. Maxwell's eyes narrowed. Why would that be in Anderson Group's archives? Maybe someone copied it years ago, Andrew shrugged. Maybe Olivia kept it. Adana's breath caught. What if that's what my mother was protecting? What she wrote about in that letter? That evening, Inside Maxwell's secure home office, Andrew logged into the company's encrypted archive. Maxwell stood behind him. Adana and Namdi leaned in, watching the screen. The folder opened. Dozens of files spilled out: blueprints, maps, payment records, voice memos. Andrew clicked on one audio file dated a week before Olivia's death. A familiar voice filled the room. "I know what Dominic did. He used fake permits to steal indigenous land. Chuka found out. Sandra helped me gather evidence. If anything happens to me, find Adana." Adana's knees buckled. Anderson caught her before she fell. "That's her," she whispered. "That's my mother's voice." Another file showed bank transfers. Millions laundered into a private offshore account linked directly to Senator Dominic Ain. It was more than enough. 2 weeks later, the story hit the media like a detonation. Senator Dominic Ain accused of land fraud, kidnapping, and human rights violations. With Maxwell's funding, the Anderson Foundation partnered with top investigative journalists. Sandra and Chuka told their stories live on national television. Olivia's voice recordings became part of a formal investigation. The government was cornered. Dominic Ain was arrested, his assets frozen, his ghost prison raided and shut down. Dozens of women walked free into daylight for the first time in years. 1 year later, Adana stood on a podium in Abuja, the national hero medal gleaming against her chest. Cameras flashed, the crowd roared. "Justice," she said into the microphone, "isn't something you wait for. It's something you rise for." Maxwell watched from the front row, applauding with pride. Beside him, Sandra held Chuka's hand. Andrew, now in his final year at university studying data science, grinned, already building a whistleblower protection platform inspired by the very story unfolding before him. That night, back at the mansion, Adana tucked her baby daughter, Sandra, into bed. As she turned off the light, Andrew's voice came from the doorway. "You know," he said with a crooked smile, "I still can't sleep unless I hear you sing." She laughed. He was taller now, broader, no longer the fragile boy she'd first met, but he would always be her little brother. She sang softly, her voice carrying through the halls. "Sleep, my child, the night is near. Angels guard and keep you dear. In your dreams, no fear will stay. You are loved in every way." Andrew leaned against the doorframe, eyes closed, a faint smile on his face. Adana looked around the mansion one last time before retiring. It had begun with a broken boy who couldn't sleep and a homeless girl who had nothing but a song. Now, a family had been restored, a nation had been shaken awake, and peace, hard-earned and unshakable, had finally taken root.